Thank you, Mr. President.
The distinguished senator from Delaware.
After two long one-on-one meetings with Mr. Rex Tillerson, and after a thorough confirmation hearing on the Foreign Relations Committee that stretched some 9 hours, and after extensive additional research and reading and digging into his record, his public statements, and his views, I announced last week that I would oppose the nomination of Rex Tillerson to be Secretary of State of the United States. I will say that over our meetings, our conversations, and my review of his record, I have come to respect Mr. Tillerson as a thoughtful and seasoned and capable professional in his line of work with impressive international business experience. And I will say that his quick action to sever financial ties with ExxonMobil is a strong example that I wish President Trump had followed with regard to his own private business interests. And I found encouraging some of Mr. Tillerson's statements in the confirmation hearing and his public stances, including his commitment to NATO, his respect for U.S. leadership in multilateral initiatives from the Paris Climate Change Agreement to the Iran deal, and his support for development programs throughout the world, but especially in Africa, a continent where I've been engaged in my 6 years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And his nomination has the support of highly respected former officials, from Brent Scowcroft and Bob Gates to James Baker and Condoleezza Rice, former secretaries and national security advisors. But Mr. Tillerson and I disagree strongly on key issues. I believe, for example, that climate change is a pressing national security threat that must be addressed. Mr. Tillerson saw it somewhat differently. I believe in advocating for human rights, for a free press, and for democracy around the world, because these principles advance our security and our economic interests here at home. I don't believe that human rights, press freedom, and democracy are add-ons, are things that we can address and deal with after national security is addressed. These are core to who we are as a nation and to the advocacy and engagement that I hope for and expect from our State Department and our next Secretary of State. These are just a few of the reasons why ultimately I decided to oppose Mr. Tillerson's confirmation, but that's not why I've come to the floor today. Mr. President, I'm here today principally because the challenge we face is not whether a single nominee is the perfect person for this particular role. The challenge we, the American people, now face is to determine the future we seek for our country on the world stage, and whether we will choose to continue to lead the free world. Do we envision the United States leading by example through actions that show we will stand by our values, especially when it is challenging or difficult? Do we envision the United States leading a coalition of democratic allies and Muslim partners around the world in the global fight on terrorism, defending each other and promoting values of human rights and rule of law and democracy? Or do we accept a dark and dystopian vision that sees the world in strict zero-sum terms, whereby any win for our allies or partners is automatically a loss for America, a vision in which we could abandon our values for political gain, a vision that distances us from the world both by a literal wall and a growing gulf in priorities? For decades, Republicans and Democrats have agreed on foundational principles of U.S. leadership in the world. We engage with the world. We consistently and reliably support our allies. We lead by example, especially on our core values. We fight for the rule of law, for human rights and democratic institutions, because doing so makes us safer and more secure. Consider our alliances. The Heritage Foundation accurately pointed out that supporting our allies overseas, and in particular our treasured and enduring alliance with our NATO partners in Western Europe, isn't charity, but rather a proven method for keeping the United States safe and secure. As Heritage puts it, alliances prevent war by driving up the cost of aggression. Alliances deter our rivals and adversaries. Alliances promote stability, help us project power, and enhance our legitimacy. Why does this matter? Why is this a current matter of debate? Why is this a pressing concern in the context of this nomination and in the work of this body? Take, for example, Russia under Vladimir Putin. It is the unanimous view of all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies that Russia conducted an organized and intentional campaign of interference in our 2016 presidential election. That Russia conducted a cyber attack authorized at the highest level with an intention to influence the outcome of our election. I cannot imagine a more direct frontal assault on who we are as a nation than to seek to influence our democratic election. But on top of that unprecedented attack on who we are as a nation, Vladimir Putin's Russia illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula and continues to support the murderous Assad regime in Syria. Today, Russia is preparing, even threatening, to intervene in upcoming elections across Europe, Central and Western Europe, including elections in our longtime close allies, France and Germany. It's been massing troops on the borders of our NATO partners, like Estonia and the other Baltic states, and conducting snap exercises all up and down the border with NATO. It is precisely because of these acts of aggression that the NATO alliance is more relevant and more important than ever. These aren't groundbreaking or controversial conclusions I'm reaching today. Yet President Trump's rhetoric as a candidate and his early actions as president, his compliments to Vladimir Putin, and his claims that NATO is obsolete, and his intimation that he may not honor our Article 5 mutual defense commitment to our NATO allies, all call into question the president's understanding of the role that our alliances play. It also calls into question whether his administration understands the consequences of weakening or abandoning these alliances. More than perhaps any nation on earth, the United States has deeply benefited from the stable world order that we helped shape following the Second World War. After Americans went throughout the world to fight the forces of fascism and imperialism in the Pacific and the European theater in the Second World War, we sat astride the world as the most powerful country on earth, with weapons possessed by no other, with the greatest manufacturing and military might on the planet, and we set about establishing an inclusive, rules-based, democratically oriented world order from which we have benefited more than any other nation. And NATO has become a key part of the alliances that we've relied on for that peace and stability in the 7 decades since. Let's not forget that the only time NATO invoked its mutual defense provision, its Article 5 clause, was when our allies came to our defense after 9/11. So to suggest that NATO is obsolete or outdated because it wasn't developed in a time where terrorism was a central threat gives the lie to the reality that our NATO allies have stood shoulder to shoulder with us, fought alongside American servicemen and women in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nearly 1,000 have given their lives, and our NATO allies have poured their blood and treasure into our defense and into our joint conduct against our enemies in Afghanistan and Iraq. Interpreters from Iraq and Afghanistan have kept our troops safe, and yet today those espousing America first would break our promises to these vital partners. And I have to ask, to what end? Mr. President, when we turn our backs on our allies and friends, there are consequences. They may be prompted to seek to help themselves in new or unexpected or dangerous ways, such as developing their own nuclear capability or seeking armaments from Russia rather than from working in partnership with us for their own security. They may seek to find new allies who do not, in fact, share our values. And in all these cases, America first may gradually, tragically become instead America alone. That leaves us less safe and closes off economic opportunities around the world. So in seeking out a strategy that is purported to make us safer and stronger, President Trump may in fact accomplish neither. A policy of America first doesn't just mean turning our backs on our allies and partners. It may also mean turning our backs on some of the world's most vulnerable people with real consequences here at home. The executive order signed by President Trump just on Friday, banning all refugees from the United States for 120 days, banning refugees for 90 days from 7 countries, and indefinitely from Syria, caused chaos and confusion at our airports and instilled concern, even fear, in American families across our country. And I have a key question today, introduced earlier by Senator Cardin, the ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, but not yet answered, which is, where does Rex Tillerson stand on this executive order? How does he see it in our place in the world? How does he understand the centrality of the example that we show to the world in how we embrace human rights? Sadly, I think this executive order has validated the claims of jihadist groups like ISIS that recruit young men on the false claim that the West is at war with Islam, which is why these very terrorist groups are today cheering this executive order. I think it has actively made us less safe by alienating Muslims in the United States and around the world. Why would we want to alienate the very Iraqis with whom we are training, serving, and fighting in the war against ISIS when they are a critical part of the ground forces whom we are counting on to liberate Mosul from the tyranny of ISIS? Most significantly, this executive order may violate our Constitution and values by banning people based not on security concerns, but on the basis of their religion, and by turning our backs on a decades-long commitment to welcome those fleeing credible fears of persecution, fleeing violence and chaos in their home countries. These may be the consequences of America First. Mr. President, it's well known, but it bears repeating, that in 1939, a ship called the St. Louis approached American shores bearing nearly 1,000, mostly Jewish refugees, fleeing the horrors of the Nazi regime and the impending Holocaust. In one of our nation's most shameful chapters, the United States turned away these refugees seeking our shores. One passenger on board the St. Louis received a telegram from the U.S. government instructing him that passengers must, quote, await their turn on the waiting list to qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they may be admissible. Most of these refugees were forced to return to Europe, where they were murdered by the Nazis. This tragic episode from 1939, born of isolationism and tragically anti-Semitism, and a mistaken sense that we could isolate ourselves from the challenges and the violence of the world, was also part of a period when a group whose name was the America First Committee mobilized to try and prevent our entry into the Second World War. I will say that these are the consequences of America First. The United States ultimately is less safe. Our allies may be made to feel uncertain or even betrayed. Americans will find themselves more fearful, and our values with which we have sought to lead the world are cast aside. Mr. President, that's why I believe this debate today is about far more than a single nominee for an important post in our State Department. American leadership on the world stage is not as simple as America First. And the consequences of truly embracing the dystopian vision of America First, I think, will be tragic. If Mr. Tillerson is confirmed, it is my sincere and earnest hope that he will challenge President Trump to rethink the dark and dystopian view of the world that he laid out in his inaugural address, and that he will instead bend his skills and character and qualities to the hard work of realigning our role in the world to the course that Republicans and Democrats together have steered from this floor and from this body for 7 decades. As the world saw last weekend, the new Trump administration desperately needs someone in the room to speak truth to power and to temper its worst impulses. With that, Mr. President, thank you, and yield the floor.